At the DMV line on Friday, my daughter leaned toward me, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Don't list me as emergency contact." She said it quickly, as if tearing off a bandage, then straightened, eyes forward, as though nothing had passed between us. I stared at the clipboard in my hand. The form swam for a moment, the letters blurring. Emergency contact. One line, one name, one phone number. My pen hovered over the blank space, then pulled back. I smiled, a strange, stiff sort of smile, the kind that pulls at the corners of your mouth but doesn't reach your chest. I didn't ask why. I didn't protest. I simply left it empty, the inkless line cutting through me more sharply than her words had. The DMV smelled of disinfectant and exhaustion. People shifted in their chairs, numbers buzzed across the digital screen, a baby wailed somewhere in the back. Ordinary noise. Ordinary day. Yet my daughter's sentence split my world in two, before and after. Before, I might have assumed I still held a certain role in her life, even if only in name. After, I knew I didn't. I kept glancing at her profile as we inched forward. She was scrolling her phone, thumb moving with practiced indifference. Her hair fell over her shoulder, the same shade of chestnut it had been when she was a child. I remembered brushing it, untangling knots while she winced and tugged away. I used to braid it before school, weaving ribbons through. Now she tucked it behind her ear, businesslike, self-sufficient, as if the girl I had mothered so carefully was a stranger who had only borrowed that face. Number 72, the speaker announced. The crowd shifted again. I swallowed hard. My paper still fluttered in my hand, blank where it mattered. It wasn't until we sat at the clerk's counter that the silence between us settled heavy. I signed where I needed to sign, pushed papers across, smiled when prompted. She did the same, efficient, brisk. To the clerk, we must have looked like any mother and adult daughter running errands together. Only I knew I had just been erased in one of the smallest, cruelest ways. We walked out into the bright Friday air. I squinted at the sun, clutching the papers in a too tight grip. My daughter was already a few steps ahead, tapping on her phone again. "I'll call you later," she said, without looking up, and then she was gone, sliding into her car and pulling out of the lot before I'd even unlocked mine. I sat there for a moment, my keys cold in my palm. Around me, traffic pulsed, people moved, the world carried on. I started the engine, drove home, and parked in my usual spot. My house looked the same, tidy lawn, curtains drawn, the faint rattle of the neighbors' wind chimes. Everything familiar. But when I shut the door behind me, I felt the emptiness settle like dust. Inside, I placed the DMV papers on the counter. The blank line glared up at me. Emergency contact, ____________. For years, I had been hers. For years, she had been mine. Now, apparently, neither was true. I made tea. That's what I do when words won't settle inside me. I boiled the kettle, dropped a bag into the chipped blue mug I've had since she was little, and poured. The steam rose, curling around my face. I sat at the table and let it cool. A memory came uninvited, the time she broke her arm at age 9. We were at the playground, she had climbed higher than usual, and I had called out, "Careful." She had laughed, fearless, before slipping. The crack of bone had sounded louder than it should have, like a branch snapping. At the hospital, they asked for emergency contact information. I had scrawled my own name, hand shaking. When they wheeled her away for x-rays, she clung to my sleeve until they gently pried her fingers loose. Back then, there was no question. Of course I was her contact. I was the one. Now, 20 years later, I sat at the same kitchen table, staring at the absence of my name on her form. I tried not to spiral. Maybe she didn't mean it harshly. Maybe she was being practical. Maybe she had someone else in mind, someone closer, more reliable. But the sting wouldn't leave. It wasn't just the request, it was the whisper. The secrecy. the way she wanted to make sure no one else heard. I went about the rest of my day in half measures. Folded laundry, though I barely remembered which drawer things belonged to. Watered the plants. Answered emails with curt politeness. All the while, that blank line pulsed at the edges of my thoughts. By evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, though I rarely drink alone. I sat by the window and watched the light fade. The neighbor's dog barked, a child rode by on a bike, the ordinary symphony of suburban dusk. My phone lay silent on the table. She didn't call. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling. I thought of my own mother, long gone now. When I was younger, we clashed more than we connected. Yet when the hospital had asked me years ago who to list, I had written her name without hesitation. There was no one else. That's what family was: flawed, imperfect, but tethered. My daughter, it seemed, had cut the tether, and done it so neatly I almost admired her precision. Morning came, as it always does. I rose, made coffee, dressed. But something had shifted. I moved slower. The air in the house felt heavier, like every room carried a question I couldn't answer. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not friends, not neighbors. It felt too raw, too humiliating, to admit aloud that my own daughter had dismissed me in such a way. I carried it quietly, like a bruise under clothing. Still, the mind wants to explain what the heart cannot accept. I kept replaying it, dissecting every word, every inflection. Don't list me as emergency contact. Not please don't, not I think you should put someone else. Just a command, delivered like an afterthought. Was it about me? About her? About something I had done, or failed to do? I wanted to call her, to ask outright. But pride held me back. If she wanted distance, I wouldn't chase her. I had chased enough over the years, after teenage storms, after college silences, after arguments that stretched weeks long. Always, it was me reaching across the gap. Always, it was me who wanted to patch the cracks. That Friday night, I sat at the table again, tea cooling beside me, the form spread out as if it might offer answers. My pen rested nearby. I considered writing her name anyway, against her wishes. Just to see it there, black ink on paper, as though claiming the role could make it true again. But I didn't. I left it blank, folded the form, and placed it in the drawer. Something about the emptiness unsettled me. It was not only the absence of her name. It was the absence of mine. Who would I even put there, if not her? I had friends, yes. Acquaintances. But no one I could call at 2 a.m, no one who would show up at a hospital bed without question. I realized, with a jolt, that I had built my life around being her contact. Around being her first call, her safety net. Without that role, who was I? The kettle whistled again, sharp and insistent. I poured another cup, sat back down, and let the night swallow me. The weekend arrived, bringing with it the quiet I once cherished but now dreaded. Saturdays had always been my days of slow errands, a walk through the market, a stop at the bakery, folding towels in sunlight. Little rituals that made solitude feel like choice. But that Saturday, every silence pressed harder, reminding me of the line I hadn't filled. I woke early, though I'd hardly slept. Coffee tasted bitter, no matter how much cream I poured in. The newspaper lay unread, headlines blurring together. The kettle hissed again before noon, though I wasn't thirsty. I was simply restless, searching for something to do with my hands, something that might drown out the echo of her whisper. By mid-morning, I forced myself out of the house. The air was cool, the kind that carries a hint of rain even if the clouds refuse to open. At the market, I drifted between stalls, fingering apples without buying any, nodding at familiar faces without stopping to chat. People bustled with lists and bags, children tugged at sleeves, laughter broke out at the flower stand. All of it felt slightly out of reach, as though I were pressing my nose against a glass pane, watching life move on the other side. At one stall, a woman I vaguely knew from the neighborhood stopped me. "How's your daughter doing?" she asked brightly, rearranging her bouquet. I smiled the practiced smile I'd worn at the DMV. "She's fine. Busy." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Busy with what? I didn't know. Busy with whom? I didn't ask. The woman nodded, satisfied, and I walked away, clutching a bunch of carrots I hadn't intended to buy. Back home, I roasted the carrots with olive oil and rosemary. The smell filled the kitchen, earthy and sharp, but when I sat to eat, the flavor barely registered. I pushed the food around my plate until it cooled. The phone rang once that afternoon. My heart leapt, unreasonably hopeful. But it was a telemarketer, cheerful in her script. I hung up gently, almost grateful to have heard a human voice. That evening, I wandered into the spare room, the one where her childhood things still lingered. Boxes of old school projects, a shelf of books with her handwriting inside the covers, a photo from her graduation tilted slightly in its frame. Dust clung to the corners, but I hadn't had the heart to clear it all away. Standing there, I felt both comforted and mocked. She had left pieces of herself here, but she no longer wanted me in the pieces of her life. I sat on the bed and picked up a book from the shelf. Inside the cover, in her teenage scrawl, she had written, "If found, return to Mom, she'll know what to do." I ran my finger over the words. Once, I was the person who knew what to do. Now, I wasn't even someone she wanted listed in a box on a form. Sleep came late again, restless and thin. By Sunday morning, I felt worn down by my own thoughts. I forced myself into action, laundry, vacuuming, polishing silver I hadn't touched in years. The house gleamed by afternoon, but I felt no lighter. I tried calling her, just once. It rang 3 times before her voicemail clicked on. "It's me," I said, then hesitated. What was I calling for? To ask why she had whispered it? To demand an explanation? To plead? None of those seemed right. "I hope you're well," I finished instead, and hung up. She didn't call back. That night, I sat again at the kitchen table, the form pulled from the drawer. I stared at the blank line, as if my persistence might coax an answer. Who else could I put there? My sister, perhaps, though she lived states away and we barely spoke more than once a year. A friend, though most had their own families, their own burdens. It struck me with an almost physical force, I had no one. Not in the way the question required. Not in the way it used to be her, without thought. Monday morning, the world reset for everyone else. Cars lined the street, children clutched backpacks, workers hurried with coffee in hand. I sat with my tea and realized I had built my entire identity around being hers, her mother, her call, her contact. Without that tether, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. It frightened me, that realization. Frightened me more than the silence of the house, more than the blank line on the form. What did I have, apart from her? What had I built for myself? I carried the question into the week like a stone in my pocket. At work, I moved through tasks mechanically. In conversations, I nodded without absorbing words. Each night, I returned to the quiet house, poured tea, stared at the form. By Wednesday, I noticed something small but strange. I no longer cried when I thought about her whisper. The sting remained, but the tears had dried. Instead, there was a dull ache, a kind of resignation. I wondered if this was what aging meant, not just the body stiffening, but the roles you thought were permanent being quietly taken from you, one by one. On Thursday, I stopped at a bookstore after work. I hadn't been inside for months. I wandered the aisles aimlessly, fingers trailing over spines. In the memoir section, I picked up a book by a woman who had traveled alone in her 60s. She wrote about airports, language barriers, and the shock of discovering joy where she least expected it. I stood there, reading the introduction, and for the first time since the DMV, I felt something stir inside me. Not joy, exactly. Not hope, either. but a flicker of curiosity. At the counter, I bought the book along with a small journal, though I wasn't sure what I'd write in it. Back home, I set them on the nightstand. That night, I read 3 chapters before sleep finally came heavy and deep. Friday marked a week since the DMV. The form still sat in the drawer, blank. My phone still hadn't lit up with her name. But something had shifted, subtly. Instead of waiting for her to call, I began waiting for myself, for some sign that I still existed outside of her absence. After work, I stopped at the bakery. I bought a small loaf of sourdough, still warm from the oven. The clerk wrapped it in paper, handed it to me with a smile. I carried it home like a fragile gift. That evening, I sliced into it, the crust crackling, the steam rising. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, as though I were reminding myself that small pleasures still belonged to me. It wasn't much. But it was something. The journal sat untouched on my nightstand for several days. Each night I'd open the book I'd bought at the store, reading about the woman who had boarded flights to places she couldn't pronounce, who had navigated train stations with only a phrasebook in her pocket. She had gotten lost, found herself again, made friends in markets where she didn't know the currency. I admired her boldness, her willingness to look foolish and be changed. Yet when I picked up the journal, pen hovering above the first blank page, I froze. What would I even write? That my daughter had whispered me out of her life? That my name wasn't worth the ink on a government form? That the silence of my house rattled louder than any clock? I closed the journal, slid it back on the nightstand, and turned off the lamp. The pages would wait until I had something worth saying. Still, the book seeped into me. On Saturday, instead of retreating into the endless cycle of laundry and tea, I took the bus downtown. I hadn't done that in years. Usually I drove everywhere, from habit and convenience. But the bus offered something different, a seat among strangers, the hum of voices, the simple act of not being in control of the wheel. I got off near the art museum. I hadn't planned it. My feet carried me there before my mind caught up. The building rose in stone, familiar yet strange, as though it belonged to an earlier version of myself. I used to take my daughter here when she was little. She would run through the sculpture garden, tugging at my hand to hurry into the next room. "Look, Mom!" "Look," she'd exclaim, as though she were the one showing me the world. I paid the entrance fee and wandered slowly through the galleries. Paintings I had seen before seemed new, as if their colors had deepened in the years since. I lingered in front of one canvas, a small seaside village, all blues and whites. Something about the stillness of it, the quiet harbor, calmed me. In a corner of the gallery, a group of young students sketched, their pencils scratching softly against paper. I watched them for a while, the ease with which they translated light into line. One of them glanced up at me and smiled politely before returning to her sketch. I realized then how long it had been since I allowed myself to stand still, to simply look at something without rushing. When my daughter was young, everything was motion, snacks, car rides, homework, practice, sleepovers. Even after she moved out, I filled the hours with tasks, as though activity alone could prove I still mattered. Standing there, I felt something loosen. After the museum, I stopped at a small cafe. I ordered soup and bread, sat by the window, and wrote the word "begin" on the first page of my journal. Just one word, written in uneven letters. It didn't matter that the page looked bare. It was a start. The following week, I began walking in the evenings. At first, just around the block, then further, past the park, past the bakery, down streets I hadn't turned onto in years. The air grew cooler as autumn settled in, leaves beginning to curl at the edges. Neighbors nodded as I passed, some offering small talk. I nodded back, surprised by how much I enjoyed even the briefest exchange. On one of those walks, I passed a community center. A flyer taped to the window caught my eye: creative writing workshop, Thursdays, 6 p.m. I stood there longer than necessary, pretending to check my phone while I memorized the details. I walked home with the image of the flyer stuck in my mind. That Thursday, I almost didn't go. Doubts circled me like gnats. I hadn't written anything in years, not even letters. What if everyone else was younger? Smarter? What if they asked me to read aloud? I paced my kitchen, kettle boiling over, hands restless. Finally, I grabbed my coat, stuffed the journal into my bag, and left before I could change my mind. The workshop met in a small, bright room with folding chairs arranged in a circle. There were about 10 of us, men and women of varying ages, though most closer to my daughters than to mine. The facilitator, a gentle-eyed man with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, welcomed us warmly. He asked us to introduce ourselves, share why we were there. When it was my turn, I said simply, I used to write. I thought I'd try again. My voice trembled slightly, but no one seemed to notice. We spent the evening writing short prompts, 10 minutes at a time, then sharing if we wished. I didn't read mine aloud. Instead, I listened as others shared their words, raw and imperfect, sometimes stumbling, sometimes brilliant. There was a kind of electricity in the room, the kind that hums when people risk a piece of themselves. I left that night lighter than I had felt in weeks. At home, I opened my journal again. This time, I wrote more than a single word. I wrote about the DMV line, about the whisper, about the blank form. Not polished, not pretty, but true. When I finished, I closed the book and sat in silence. For the first time since that Friday, I felt something close to relief. Days turned into weeks. The ache of my daughter's rejection didn't vanish, but it shifted. It no longer sat at the center of every thought. Instead, it became one note in a larger melody, sometimes loud, sometimes soft. I still checked my phone more often than I admitted, still scanned for her name, still felt the sting when it wasn't there. But I also walked, and wrote, and showed up on Thursdays with my journal tucked under my arm. One evening after class, I stayed behind to talk with the facilitator. His name was David. He asked how I felt about writing again. Like I'm waking up, I admitted. Slowly. He nodded, as though he understood. That's all it takes. Waking up. The phrase stayed with me. By the end of the month, I noticed subtle changes. My shoulders didn't hunch as much when I walked into a room. I greeted neighbors with more ease. I rearranged my living room furniture one afternoon, just because I wanted to see the light fall differently. I bought myself a scarf, soft wool, deep green, and wore it proudly, even when no one saw. Still, the form remained in the drawer, blank. I hadn't decided what to do with it. But instead of glaring at me, it had become a quiet reminder of what I had lost, yes, but also of what I might yet choose. One Saturday, as I walked through the market again, I stopped at the flower stand. For years I had avoided buying flowers for myself. They felt frivolous, temporary. But that day, I chose a bundle of sunflowers, their bright heads bobbing as the vendor wrapped them. At home, I placed them in a vase on the kitchen table. Their presence startled me each time I walked by, bold, unapologetic, alive. I found myself smiling at them without meaning to. It struck me then, perhaps life after rejection wasn't about filling the empty space with someone else's name. Perhaps it was about learning to see myself again, in colors I had forgotten belonged to me. The sunflowers wilted after a week, their yellow faces bowing until petals dropped onto the table. I considered tossing them straight into the trash, but instead I clipped a few of the sturdier blooms and pressed them between the pages of my journal. They left faint stains as they dried, smudges of yellow and brown, but I didn't mind. It felt important to keep some trace of them, a reminder of that small act of defiance, of buying beauty just for myself. As the days grew shorter, my walks became brisker. I began to notice the rhythm of the neighborhood in ways I hadn't before. The same man walking his dog at 6. The boy practicing free throws at the hoop nailed to his garage. The woman 2 streets over who always tended to her roses at dusk, her wide-brimmed hat tipped low even when the sun was gone. Their lives brushed against mine in brief, nameless ways, and I found comfort in it. We didn't need to know one another deeply to still share the same sidewalks, the same weather, the same hours of light. Yet even as I stitched myself into the fabric of my days, my daughter's absence gnawed at the edges. Some mornings I woke with a jolt, convinced I had heard my phone buzz with her name. Other nights I caught myself setting an extra plate at the table before remembering I ate alone now. I told no one about the workshop, or the walks, or the sunflowers. These discoveries felt fragile, like seedlings I wasn't ready to expose to the elements. One evening after writing class, David approached me as we packed up our journals. "You've been quiet," he said gently. I shrugged. "I'm not sure my stories matter." He tilted his head. "They matter because they're yours. That's reason enough." I thought about that on the walk home. For so long, my stories had been woven into my daughter's, her milestones, her troubles, her triumphs. Without her, I wasn't sure what thread I had left to spin. But David's words nudged me toward something I hadn't considered. Maybe the story didn't have to be grand to be worth telling. Maybe it could be as small as a loaf of bread, a pressed flower, a walk in the cold. The following Thursday, our prompt was write about a door. My pen moved almost before I knew what I wanted to say. I wrote about the door to my daughter's childhood bedroom, how it used to slam shut during her teenage years, how I'd stand outside waiting for the storm inside to pass, how I still catch myself pausing in the hallway, listening for sounds that will never come. When it came time to share, I surprised myself by reading aloud. My voice wavered, but I made it through. Silence hung in the room after I finished. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, but the heavy, respectful kind. Then one of the younger women leaned forward. "That was beautiful," she said softly. I could feel it. The words warmed me more than I expected. On the way home, I realized my hands weren't clenched the way they usually were. Still, progress is rarely a straight line. A week later, at the grocery store, I saw my daughter's favorite cereal on the shelf. Without thinking, I reached for it, placing the box in my cart. Only when I was at the checkout did I realize what I'd done. I stared at the box, debating whether to put it back, but in the end I bought it. At home, I slid it into the cupboard and shut the door quickly, as though hiding evidence. The next morning, I stood staring at the box. Finally, I poured myself a bowl. The taste was too sweet, cloying. I ate it anyway, spoon scraping against the sides. When I finished, I rinsed the bowl and pushed the box to the back of the shelf. It sat there like a reminder I didn't want but couldn't discard. Around that time, I received a letter from the DMV reminding me to finalize my paperwork. I pulled the form from the drawer. The line still mocked me, empty. I sat at the table with my pen poised, hand trembling. At last, I wrote down my neighbor's name, the woman with the roses. We weren't close, but she had once told me, "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock." I doubted she had meant hospital at midnight, but I wrote her name anyway, then folded the form neatly. Dropping it in the mailbox, I felt a strange mix of defeat and relief. I had followed the rules. I had chosen someone. Yet as the envelope slid from my fingers, I couldn't shake the thought that I had replaced myself in my daughter's life with a near stranger in mine. That evening, I walked longer than usual, circling blocks until my legs ached. I ended at the community center, where music drifted from a dance class inside. I pressed against the cool glass, watching pairs move clumsily but joyfully across the floor. Their laughter spilled into the street whenever someone missed a step. For a moment, I let myself imagine walking in, slipping into the line, feeling someone's hand steady mine. Then the music stopped, the door opened, and I stepped quickly away, embarrassed by my own longing. The days rolled forward. Thanksgiving approached, then Christmas. In past years, holidays had been loud affairs, my daughter cooking alongside me, the two of us bickering over seasoning, laughing at burnt rolls. That year, the house stayed quiet. I bought a small chicken instead of a turkey, roasted it with herbs, and ate it alone. I lit a candle at the table, not for festivity but for company. She didn't call. On New Year's Eve, I sat by the window and watched fireworks spark over the neighborhood. Families cheered, voices carrying through the night. I whispered to myself, this year, I'll matter to myself. The words felt both foolish and necessary. January brought snow, heavy enough to blanket the streets. I shoveled my walkway, breath puffing in the air, muscles straining. When I finished, I stood in the quiet, admiring the clean path I had made. It struck me then, no one had asked me to do it, no one had expected it, yet I had carved a way through for myself. The thought stayed with me longer than the cold. At the next writing class, David asked us to write about something we had let go. I wrote about the emergency contact line, how it had stayed blank, how I had filled it reluctantly, how it still haunted me. When I read it aloud, I braced for pity. Instead, another man in the group shared that his own daughter hadn't spoken to him in years. A woman admitted she had been erased from her sister's will. We were strangers, yet suddenly I didn't feel so alone in my loss. On the walk home, snow crunching beneath my boots, I realized that hurt binds people together just as much as joy. That night, I opened my journal and wrote, I am more than a blank line. The words looked shaky, almost childish, but they felt true. February brought a string of gray days, the kind where the sky presses low and everything feels muffled. Normally, those weeks would have sunk me deeper into silence. But this year, I kept moving. I went to writing class, I walked even when the sidewalks were slick, I cooked meals that weren't just practical but intentional, soups that simmered for hours, breads that filled the house with warmth. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was life. And life, I was learning, had its own quiet dignity. One Thursday evening, after class, David asked if I'd thought about sharing my work outside the group. There's an open mic night at the library next month, he said. No pressure. Just consider it. The idea startled me. Standing up in front of strangers, bearing words that had come from the tenderest parts of me? I shook my head quickly. I don't think that's for me. But later, at home, the thought lingered. I pictured myself at the lectern, reading about doors, or blank forms, or pressed flowers. I imagined my voice carrying across a room, strangers listening, nodding, perhaps even seeing themselves in my words. The image frightened me, but it also stirred something like longing. The next morning, as I walked past the bakery, I stopped abruptly and turned inside. I bought 2 loaves, one for myself, one for the woman with the roses. She looked surprised when I knocked at her door, bread wrapped in paper under my arm. For you, I said awkwardly. A thank you, I suppose, for being someone I could write down. Her eyes softened. That's kind of you, she said, taking the bread carefully. Then she added, you know, I'm glad you did. If you ever need anything, truly, don't hesitate. I walked home lighter than I had arrived, as though the simple act of giving had loosened a knot inside me. The following week, I gathered my courage and told David I would sign up for the open mic. He smiled warmly, as if he had known all along I would. Preparing for it, I filled page after page in my journal, scratching out lines, rewriting them, circling back. I settled on the piece about the bedroom door. It felt raw enough to matter, yet polished enough to stand. Each evening, I practiced reading aloud, my voice echoing off the kitchen walls. At first, I stumbled, my throat tightening. But slowly, the words began to flow. The night of the event, my hands shook as I walked to the lectern. The library's community room buzzed with chatter, the chairs filled with an assortment of faces, some young, some older, some strangers, some vaguely familiar. My knees wobbled as I adjusted the microphone. Then I began. At first, my voice sounded foreign to me, thin and unsure. But as I read, something shifted. The words anchored me, steadying my breath. I looked up once, halfway through, and saw heads tilted, eyes focused, hands folded quietly in laps. They were listening. Really listening. When I finished, there was a pause, and then applause, gentle but real. I stepped back, cheeks flushed, heart pounding. For a moment, I felt as though I had reclaimed a part of myself I hadn't even realized I'd lost. That night, walking home under the glow of street lamps, I whispered into the cold air, I am still here. In the weeks that followed, I carried that night with me like a flame cupped in my palms. It didn't erase the ache of my daughter's absence, but it lit small corners of my life that had long been dark. I said yes more often, to coffee with a coworker, to a museum exhibit with a neighbor, to lingering in the cafe after class. None of these gestures were grand, but each one stretched me a little further beyond the boundaries I had built around myself. Still, grief has a way of resurfacing when least expected. One afternoon, I opened my email to find a message from the hospital system, a generic reminder to update emergency contacts. My chest tightened. Even as I read the impersonal lines, my daughter's whisper returned as vividly as if she were standing beside me. That night, I couldn't bring myself to write. Instead, I sat at the table staring at the vase where the sunflowers had once stood. Empty now, just a thin rim of dust where the stems had been. I considered buying new flowers, but something stopped me. Perhaps I wanted the emptiness to remind me that even small joys fade. The next day, as if in defiance of my own heaviness, I walked further than usual, down to the river. The water was high from melted snow, rushing past with a fierce energy. I leaned on the railing, listening to the roar, letting it drown out the noise inside me. For a brief moment, I imagined stepping into it, letting the current carry me wherever it wished. Not as surrender, but as release. I didn't, of course. Instead, I turned back toward home, but the image stayed with me, of being carried, of not resisting so much. By March, the days grew longer, the air softer. Buds appeared on trees, timid but insistent. One Saturday, I returned to the market and bought tulips, pink and white. I placed them on the table without hesitation. This time, I didn't press them into pages when they wilted. I let them go, petals scattering where they fell. Around then, I heard my daughter's name in passing. A coworker mentioned seeing her at a cafe downtown, laughing with friends. I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside my stomach clenched. The image of her, alive, well, radiant perhaps, collided painfully with the silence she left for me. That night, I debated calling her. I even dialed the number, finger hovering over call. But I couldn't press it. The thought of her voice, distant or impatient, felt worse than the silence. I set the phone down and opened my journal instead. I wrote, I don't know if she remembers me the way I remember her. But I am learning to remember myself. The words steadied me. As spring unfolded, I kept testing myself in small ways. I joined a beginner's dance class at the community center, awkward at first, my feet clumsy, my body stiff. But I laughed, along with the others, when we collided or spun the wrong way. That laughter surprised me, it had been so long since it rose unforced. I also began planning small trips, nothing like the woman in the book, not yet, but a bus ride to a nearby town, a museum in the city, even just a new cafe across town. Each outing reminded me that the world hadn't closed its doors to me, even if one door in particular remained firmly shut. Through it all, my daughter stayed silent. No calls, no visits, no explanations. At times, the ache of it still left me breathless, like a sudden cold wind. But I no longer let it freeze me entirely. Instead, I wrapped myself in what I had: words, walks, tulips, bread, neighbors, laughter. Small, ordinary things. And in their ordinariness, I found something extraordinary, a sense of myself returning. One evening in April, as I walked home from class, I paused outside my house and looked up at the windows glowing softly in the dusk. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see emptiness waiting inside. I saw space, mine, unshared, unclaimed, but alive with possibility. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and whispered into the quiet, "Welcome home." Spring unfurled quickly that year, as though the world itself was impatient to be alive again. The tulips gave way to lilacs, the air thick with their sweetness. My walks grew longer, my steps surer. I no longer traced the same familiar routes, instead, I wandered, letting curiosity guide me. Sometimes I ended at the park, sometimes by the river, sometimes at the bakery where I'd sit with a cup of coffee and write while strangers moved around me. I thought often of my daughter. Not in the sharp, breathless way I had at first, but in a quieter, steadier ache. Her silence still stung. I still caught myself wanting to dial her number, still replayed her whisper at the DMV line. But I had begun to accept that wanting and having were not the same. I could want her closeness, her voice, her trust, but I could not make it so. One afternoon, I returned to the art museum. The same seaside painting was there, unchanged, though I had changed. I stood in front of it and realized that stillness didn't mean stagnation. It meant endurance. The harbor was quiet, but alive with possibility. I took out my journal and sketched a few lines, not of the painting itself, but of how it made me feel. Calm doesn't mean empty. It means ready. That evening, I finally returned to the DMV form in my thoughts. The envelope was long gone, processed somewhere in a drawer I'd never see. But the memory of that blank line had followed me like a shadow. For months, I had treated it as a mark of loss, proof that I had been erased. Now, I wondered if it had also been a beginning, the space where I first chose to step forward without her. The woman with the roses waved to me from her yard as I walked home. I waved back, and for once I didn't feel the need to explain myself. Life didn't require justification. It only required living. On the last night of April, I lit a candle again at the table. Not for company this time, but for gratitude. I ate bread, warm from the oven, and read through old journal entries. The early pages were jagged, raw with grief. The later ones bent towards something steadier, almost gentle. Before blowing out the candle, I wrote one final line: I am my own emergency contact now. And as the flame went out, I felt no emptiness, only a quiet, enduring light inside me that no form could take away.